Dr. Susan Jones at Palm Beach Atlantic University to get us some seasonal dates for live meetings starting in September. I don't know how that's going to go in our epicenter, Florida. So we will have another Zoom meeting in August. And if things don't look good for a live meeting in September, we will continue Zoom meetings every month. And I like them, whether we have live meetings or not, actually, because we get to see people from out of Florida. Anyone who's from out of our local area, could you introduce yourself? Okay, Kristen.
Hi, I'm Kristen Miller-Zone. I'm the regional coordinator for the Georgia region, and I live in Columbus, Georgia.
Fabulous.
Can I say something? This is Alice Davenport. I'm in Eugene, Oregon.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm in Vancouver, BC in Canada.
Thank you, Dorian.
Now, I'm a member of the Palm Beach group. I come during the winter, but I'm right now in Toronto, Canada.
Oh.
No, you Karen.
I would never have had a chance to be with you at this time of year.
And I think this
is
wonderful.
Terrific.
Hi, I'm
Marcia.
I'm Ellen Moody. I'm Ellen Moody. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. And you see with me my cat, Ian.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome. Marcia.
Hi, I'm Marcia Hamley. I'm a regional co-coordinator for Oregon and Southwest Washington. I'm
Wonderful.
in Portland. So I'm in Portland, so I'm about 100 miles from what I couldn't make out Davenport's first name. In Eugene?
I'm Alice.
Alice. Hi, Alice.
Yeah, I get your emails all the time.
Oh, great.
And where are you from, Alice?
Eugene, Oregon.
Okay. Oh, 3 more people joining us. Did everyone from out of state introduce themselves so far?
I'm Lori Mulligan Davis, and I'm in Chicagoland.
Wonderful.
And I'm on the steering committee for the 2021 AGM.
Jane Austen and the Arts, correct?
Yes.
I hope to be there. Here comes somebody else.
I'm Michelle, and I'm from the JASNA Southwest region in California.
Wonderful. Welcome. We are asking people who are joining our meeting, welcome everyone. If you're from out of state Florida, please introduce yourself. Shelley, where are you from? You have to unmute yourself. When you come into the meeting, you're muted.
Hi. Hello, everyone. I am a resident of Florida, but I am in Connecticut fleeing Florida's COVID response right now.
Wonderful. Welcome. Anyone else from out of state?
Hi, I'm Arlene Meyer, and I live in Georgia, and this is my first year in JASNA, and I've been enjoying it very much and been able to catch up on a lot this summer.
Wonderful. Well, we have 31 people in the meeting now, and I think we're going to get going. Welcome, Jamie. I'm glad you made it. Now, we request that everyone remains muted unless they're going to speak, and then you obviously have to unmute yourself and then remute so we don't hear dogs barking and papers rustling. I am Elizabeth Paquette, and I am the co-coordinator with Patty Woodall here in the meeting in the Palm Beaches region here in South Florida for JASNA. Patty is listed as Phil Woodall, but she's really Patty Woodall. Hi, Patty. Well, today's topic, fathers in Jane Austen. So Patty and I are going to just say a few brief words, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. We've got one more person that wants to come in. Did they get in? Hey, Nick. Oh, she's using her her model picture. Cool. So everyone can hear me.
Yes, yes.
All right, good. Just you can nod ahead. All right. Let's get just a couple brief introductory words about fathers in Jane Austen's novels. I really like this topic, and I did a little research on fathers in general and what makes a good father. And we have to remember Regency England was a patriarchal society. Fathers had all the financial responsibility and the final say in all important matters. You know, in Jane's novels, the scenarios with the fathers are very often comical, but the issues were really very serious, especially for the daughters and sons, but especially the daughters. Any failings that we see from the daughters and sons are due to the parental failures, obviously. So what are the main duties of any father? Financial security, which we see several of the fathers fall down on, the Mr. Bennets, the Sir Walter Elliots, the deceased Mr. Dashwood. These offspring are in dire straits and don't even have a place to live when these fathers pass away because of entailment. Second, educating their daughter. Not educating them in algebra or necessarily, but literature, history, languages, math, geography, music, drawing, manners and etiquette. And what's the goal of all of that? So that their daughters will be interesting, will be socially confident, and will find good matches, good husbands. And lastly, father's responsibility is moral principles. He's supposed to give his children a good sense of right and wrong, because once respectability is lost, it's irretrievable, especially for a female at this time. Think of Lydia, think of Maria Rushworth. They eloped, even Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay. Julia Bertram and Yates, they ran off together, but they did get married. So there were some moral failings on some of our characters, but to wrap it up, what I'm gonna say, there'd be no story if every father in the books was perfect. And I look at this and I say to myself, a lot of the plot line in these stories really revolves around the father's failings and their children trying to get through society. Well, I'm going to hand this over now to Patty, who's going to have some fun with you, and then we'll open the discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to start you off with a little quiz. And I'm going to have some quotes or things about fathers, and you guess who it is. Actually, these are very, very simple, so you'll get them all. All right, here's the first one. I should recommend gallons, the constant use of gallons during the spring months. She has been using it at my recommendation, and you see how it has carried away her freckles. Who's that?
Anybody have an answer?
Walter Elliot. I mean,
Yeah.
Sir, yeah.
Sir Walter, yeah, the father. All right, good.
The vain father who can't manage his money.
Can't manage his money. Okay, number 2. Next to being married, a girl likes to be crossed a little in love now and then. It is something to think of, and it gives her a sort of distinction among her companions. Who's that?
Mr. Bennett.
Mr. Bennett, that's right, very good. And here's the very easiest one, I think. It is never safe to sit out of doors, my dear. Who's that?
Woodhouse.
Mr. Woodhouse.
Woodhouse, good. All right, this one may be a little bit more difficult. I am an advocate for early marriages, where there are means in proportion, and would have every man with a sufficient income settle as soon as 24 as he can be.
Sir Thomas, my favorite.
Yes, that's Sir Thomas. Very good. All right. Now I had to put some pronouns in for this one to hide the identity. He, though so charming a man, seemed always a check upon his children's spirits, and scarcely anything was said but by himself, the observation of which, with his discontent, at whatever the inn afforded, and his angry impatience at the waiters made her grow every moment more in awe of him, and appeared to be what their 2 hours seemed to be like 4. All right, who's that?
General
Tillman.
Tilney, good. All right, here's another one. I can use them more than once. So here's another. They had none of them much to recommend, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but she has something more of quickness than her sisters.
Mr. Bennett.
Mr. Bennett. Okay. And one more. Excuse me for a minute. Okay. He makes things much easier by dying at the beginning of the novel. Is that?
Mr. Dashwood.
Mr. Dashwood, yes. Easier for him, but not for his family, of course. Okay. And another thing, we were talking about this the other day, that this was a very patriarchal society. However, there were many absent mothers in Jane Austen's work, and that caused the dynamic between the father and the children to be a little bit different. So we could keep that in mind as well as we're discussing this. So, okay, Elizabeth, back to you.
I also wanted to say, I think that, and you see it in some of the novels, the fathers don't treat all their children the same. I mean, look at Mr. Bennett. He has favoritism. And that might be true in today's world too. I mean, I'm an only child, so I don't know. I was the favorite. But I read a more recent article analyzing fathers. And, you know, research has been done on types of parenting. You've got the authoritarian father, like General Tilney. You've got the permissive, indulgent father. Who might that be?
Mr. Bennett.
Someone like Mr. Woodhouse. He lets her do anything she wants, but he loves her. He's indulgent. And then you have the permissive, indifferent father or parent, and we seem to have a few of those. I mean, you know, Mr. Bennett is very permissive and he's indifferent to most of his children. And then the last one, they say an authoritative, not authoritarian, but authoritative are nurturers who love their offspring and allow them to assist in setting limits and controls. These children are the happiest and the best, well-adjusted and socially responsible children, which I don't think we have a lot of those in those books. So what's your favorite father in the novels? Or least favorite?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I actually don't have a favorite father. Most of them are pretty deeply flawed, but there are men in a couple of the books who fill that role for our heroines rather nicely. Mr. Gardner in Pride and Prejudice was material in getting Lydia's situation sorted and supported both Jane and Elizabeth frequently. In Persuasion, I think Admiral Croft was well on the way to becoming a father figure for Anne. She looked up to him in ways she never could have looked up to her father. The most benign, I think, is possibly Catherine's father in Northanger Abbey, but that's only because he's almost invisible. we don't. She turned out to be a really nice kid, and we don't have any reason to assume he hindered that. So that's kind of my take on it.
I worry about Mr. Moreland because he allowed his daughter to go off, and he seems awfully permissive. I mean, she could have gotten into a lot of trouble, and she was so naive. But as we know, they had a lot of children, and he had two what do they call vicarhoods or whatever, to bring in more money. I mean, he was very busy. He didn't even have time to raise his kids.
I think he kind of relied on Catherine's mother on that, and she wasn't thrilled, but she really didn't raise any objections. And for her age, I think the mother's input would have had a lot of weight on the decision, because at that point she would be more her mother's responsibility.
And we have to give Mr. Moreland credit that when he told his daughter, you are not to marry him because General Tilney is against the match. He didn't want his daughter just running off. He wanted it to be ethical on both sides. So you got to give him credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they're good choices.
I think that Mr. Moreland has a lot going for him. I think that when Catherine goes away to Bath, her mother sits her down and talks to her and says, I know you'll be sensible. And so that perhaps is trusting, but she was more involved than any other mother usually is. And then you're right, when Catherine came back, we see her mother interacting with her, noticing her depression and saying, I have a book that I want you to read. And as she goes away, that is when Mr. Tilney comes, and they say, as long as his father objects, they don't say, no way. They don't, and they allow them to correspond. They know that they're writing letters back and forth, but they turn a blind eye to that because they're being compassionate. So I think that they're happy. It's a husband and a wife that are happy together. They're working together. I think that they're a more functional family, dynamic as a husband and wife raising children than the other Austen parents. So, I think there's a lot of positive that you can say there.
How about the Emma's brother-in-law, whose name I can't remember, but he's not very pleasant to be around, but he seems to really love his children.
Mr. Knightley's brother, Mr. Knightley.
Yeah.
Mr. John Knightley.
Yeah. Well, look at Mr. Woodhouse. He cares so much about Emma, but he's not doing any favors for her because he never sees any flaws in her.
Can I just go back to the Morelands for a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Because I agree with what Lori was saying and about the Morelands being a happy and functional family. Excuse me. I think their main flaw was naivete and just not preparing her as well, for the dangers of men in the city. But even then, they tried, and the father was supportive financially, which was about what he could do given his own pursuits. And they sent her off with Mr. Allen or Mrs. Allen to the city. And I don't think we can totally blame the Morelands for the fact that Mrs. Allen was not a super responsible guardian. That's all.
Yeah. Well, to go back to Mr. Bennett, was I just saying Mr. Bennett? What was I talking about?
Woodhouse.
Woodhouse. Let's go back to Mr. Woodhouse. Emma really was naive in her own way because she thought she was always right. She was in her own little kingdom and had total freedom. It was going to be difficult for her to get married. She really ran the house and her father let her do anything she wanted. She had it pretty nice.
Yeah, I have a quote here from the Jane Austen Society on Mr. Woodhouse, which I think is very, very showing. He's considered nervous and feeble and socially impotent. All he does is walk his grounds and entertain guests. He's much like a baby and gives Emma no strong paternal influence. Therefore, she can flourish as an individual with power. Since she has personal choices, she has freedom. But when Knightley moves in, he will be established as the dominant male presence within the home. So things are going to change when Miss
That's
Emma
right.
gets married.
Right.
But I want to say that she doesn't have power because she really doesn't have the agency to leave her father. Her father may appear to be so permissive with her, but he's really passive aggressive, and he's found a way to keep her tethered at home. She doesn't want to leave him. She can't leave him. And so in the end, Mr. Knightley has to move in. So that's not exactly encouraging your child to have agency or giving them freedom, when in fact, you've got them shackled to the dining room table.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. Yeah.
I really like Jane Austen's description of Mr. Woodhouse's gentle selfishness. And I just think that's such an amazing description, because that is that sort of passive aggressive, but you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah. I had a thought on Mr. Wentworth, or Mr. Woodhouse. He turned her loose to run the house and make decisions about her own activities before she was old enough to know how to make those decisions. So she became a young woman with an illusion of her own capabilities. By the same token, he relied on her to take care of him. So in a lot of respects, she was almost as much his parent as he was hers. And when you put those two together in a teenage girl, I mean, and let's face it, Emma's pretty young when we first meet her. And all of the action in Emma takes place over about a year. The book is not that long a read, so we forget how much time this covers. She has a lot of growing up and self-recognition to do, because her father never took the interest in her to treat her as a child and nurture her. He just kind of threw her out there without any real preparation.
And we know Emma's not particularly great at the piano. She doesn't really read the books on her reading list. She doesn't finish projects. And is she truly talented in any way?
Possibly. Her governess always thought she had tremendous capability. She was just not disciplined. Somehow he managed to find a governess that was unable to get her in line and teach her some self-discipline and some self-knowledge. So poor Emma had to get smacked around pretty good by experience just to realize her own limits and what she needed to do to get herself to the right place.
Yes, Marcia.
And I agree with that. I'm sorry, HTC Desire, what's your actual name?
Oh, that's Lauren.
Sorry?
Lauren.
Lauren, hi.
I don't know why it's got my phone model on there, but you know, I honestly didn't choose that.
Oh, that's okay. I wanted to agree with Lauren and also add that I think it's interesting dynamic with Mr. Knightley, because he comes in trying to provide some of the discipline that she's not getting from her father or her governess. And so it sort of makes an uneven relationship with them at the beginning. And as she's developing and having to grow up and gain some self-knowledge. But certainly my hope is that they're going to end up having an equal relationship, because he also comes to respect things that she does at her more mature mode later.
How about some other fathers?
I wanted to mention the Musgroves. You know, here again, we have sort of, what was the benign indifference was one of the characteristics of parenthood.
Permissive indifference.
Permissive indifference. Here again, we have yet another example of them happily sending their daughters off, in theory chaperoned, supposedly by their older brother and sister-in-law, But again, one of them nearly dies. I mean, not doing a very good job of chaperoning. And they constantly belittle their son's wife, causing yet more strife within that family unit and within the family unit as a whole. They would have rathered he married Anne because she was easygoing, but when Anne turned him down, they're just like, well, whatever, pick another sister. Just get a wealthy one and bring the name, I guess, not wealth, but bring the name into the family. But they're not doing their family unit any help by constantly adding to the strife within Charles and Mary. Is it Charles? Charles and Mary.
Yep.
And then also letting the two girls fight over Wentworth when one of them is supposedly already engaged to the cousin, Hayworth.
Uh-huh.
Where are these people? They're just too busy eating cake over in the corner.
Well, what do you think of parenting of Charles and Mary? And how are their little boys going to grow up?
What parenting? Her child nearly dies and she goes to a dinner party.
Auntie Anne will save the day.
Auntie Anne, I don't care. Even if your sister is a better nurse, you would never leave your child's bedside after such a traumatic incident.
But let's look at Charles as the husband. I mean, he obviously spends a lot of time hunting to get out of the house and away from his hypochondriac wife, Mary. But
at least one of the boys is old enough to be tagging along at that point and beginning to learn that sort of how to be a man, how to be a young man. Maybe not the youngest one who's too busy climbing all over his aunt in the corner. But again, he could be involved in raising those boys and he is not. And they're even boys, so he doesn't even have the excuse of saying, well, they're daughters, so they're Mary's problem.
yeah, not all the matches were good matches, obviously.
But even if you're unhappy in your marriage, it doesn't mean you have to neglect your children. He could still choose to be an engaged father, and he chooses not to. He chooses to let the strife within his marriage affect his ability to effectively parent. Like you can see that today in dissolved households, you know, in co-parenting situations where, because the parents are fighting so much with each other, one or the other of them ultimately neglects or ends up using the child as a tool to get back at the other parent. You know, you can choose to rise above that and still be a good parent, and he chooses not to.
I think along with you, a big problem is that both Mary and Charles are completely self-absorbed. They're both much more interested in what they want themselves than in their children or their children's needs or anyone else. And I think you're absolutely right about their fighting back and forth, but I think it's also basically a completely ingrained self-absorption.
One of the things I was going to say is the juxtaposition between Anne and her father and Elizabeth and her father. The way Jane wrote it, she wrote Mr. Bennet as Elizabeth was his favorite. And actually, he wasn't the worst father. He was aloof, but he wasn't Sir Walter either. And so you see the development, the way Jane Austen kind of developed her early character in Elizabeth with really basically a father that was there in support. And then she ends her life writing Persuasion, where Anne could not be in a worse situation. And in some ways, I kind of think she's a Cinderella character, because the way she is held in the house and the way Jane Austen kind of moves her from place to place in a developmental way. But there is no instance in my opinion, in Persuasion, where Sir Walter really comes to Anne's aid or is ever actually a father. He's such a narcissist that he can't get past it. But I find that the writing of those two books kind of interesting because it's saying something about what Jane Austen thinks about men, which I don't think is very much, and about fathering. Anyway, that's.
Well, I do have to kind of disagree with where Mr. Bennett falls on the father scale. I think he's one of the worst because he makes fun of his children. They are the silliest girls in the world. He doesn't, you know, when Mary tries to finish a sentence, he just interrupts her and just criticizes her. He has overspent, and there'll be nothing for his wife and children to live on should he die tomorrow. He kept hoping he would have a son. Well, when the book begins, his last child is already 14 years old. There's no son coming. And he had 14 years to save some money, and he hasn't done it. And he just has, you know, checked out of his family and lives in his library. I just think he's one of the most delinquent fathers. And even when, here's a quote here. When Mr. Collins comes to visit the first time, and he says, cheerfully tells his family, oh, when I am dead, Mr. Collins may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Well, he's making a joke about it, but that's quite serious. You know, it always kind of, his relationship with Elizabeth seems so sweet, but he hasn't been good to the family.
And he also, isn't it at the end that Pride and Prejudice, they talk about how he is a very unexpected house guest. He does like libraries, as you pointed out, but he goes and he shows up at the most unexpected times. You can imagine that after a while, even Elizabeth, who is apparently fond of her father, is like, oh no, not again.
Yeah, and we know that he embarrasses her. Darcy brings that to her attention. The other thing is I want to mention, remember Lady Catherine remarks to, why didn't the Bennet sisters ever have a governess? They really, and they're not really the most educated group of sisters. So they've been done a disservice in so many ways. Fortunately, two of them do find wealthy husbands.
I have a thing about Mr. Bennett.
Yes,
because we were talking about how clearly Mr. Bennett has favorites, especially with Elizabeth, and then maybe Jane second, and then the rest, who cares? And I was wondering, okay, how did he get to decide in his mind which would be his favorites? Did he have to wait till the girls developed some sort of personality? Did they seem more like him? Especially with Elizabeth, maybe that's how she became his favorite. With Jane, like, she's fine. She has a sweet temper. So yeah, you're not as hysterical as my wife. So you're gonna be my second favorite. But the rest, like Mary, like, oh, are you too, you may be studious, but you might be coming across as too preachy, so I don't care. And then of course, Lydia and Kitty, it's like, oh, you're just too like your mom. And I fell out of infatuation with your mom. Obviously I married for her looks and I don't respect her. So like, who cares about you? So I'm just wondering, it's like, okay, did he have to wait for the girls to develop their own personality in order to pick favorites?
Can I respond to that? I think a lot of that has to do with the multiple children. And if you've ever lived in a household with multiple children, their personalities often tend to get larger and larger and more distinct and more dramatic, or just more the younger they get. And I think a lot of that has to do with attention. Jane is sweet because she's the first, and she had both parents and a full staff, and maybe even a grandparent was still alive. So she never had to strive for anything in infancy and in early childhood. Then Elizabeth comes along, and Jane is sweet and cute, so maybe she gravitates towards mom. Dad is a little bit more involved. He still thinks he'll have a son, so there's still some time and energy, and he still kind of likes his daughters. Then by the time 3, 4, and 5 come along, they're basically neglected from sheer volume of work. They're very close together. They might even be like what they call Irish twins, born within like a Kitty and the two youngest.
Lydia.
Yeah, so that Mary becoming kind of obsessed with studiousness. She sees the attention her older sister gets from her father. Elizabeth is a reader. She's generally considered intelligent. So Mary over adopts that personality trait in an attempt to get attention. Then Kitty comes along and, Kitty comes along. She's a lot more like the mother. And then the youngest comes along and she practically has to scream to get any attention in this house. I think that's, obviously I don't know if that was the intent, Jane Austen's intention when she wrote them, but they're almost stereotypes, they're almost caricatures in some ways of big families.
And remember, the book makes fun of Mrs. Bennet so much about her desperate to find husbands, but that will be the bread on the table for all of them because she doesn't know when Mr. Bennet's going to drop dead. They will have nothing.
I had a thought. I think this is also a situation involving a bad marriage. Marriage quality is kind of an underlying theme. You've got the Gardners who have a good marriage and happy children, and there are a few others. And it's painfully obvious from the get-go that the Bennets really never had a chance. And I think it's very possible that part of Mr. Bennet's indifference is because of the differences in their educational levels. He's very educated, she is not. She's not interested in that. A lot of this is left up to speculation, but he may have wanted the girls to have a governess and she couldn't see the point. She didn't need a governess. She caught her husband without one. She was so focused on the potential situation that she focused on their appearance and being able to meet men. I mean, having them all out at one time, which meant Lydia was thrown into situations well before she was prepared. And he may have just gotten to a point where he just couldn't deal with fighting with her.
But
And
a huge responsibility
and
of a
absorbed in his own interest.
A huge responsibility of a father of any era, but especially we're talking about Jane Austen's era, was protecting daughters, protecting them from men that were going to lead them astray.
Yes.
Yet it's happening in these novels.
Yes, and I'm about to drop a very unpopular opinion about that, Elizabeth. Okay. I think Harriet Smith's father was a better father than Colonel Brandon or Darcy. Darcy and Colonel Brandon were put in a position of being a father figure to Darcy, to Georgiana, and Colonel Brandon to his ward. And what ended up happening to those girls? They provided for them financially, gave them a quality upbringing. But once they get to that impressionable age, they entrusted them to people who were not looking out for them. And they both ended up, well, one girl was completely ruined. Georgiana was saved, but only, because of the Darcy fortune, they could really or the Darcy's power, they could come in and rescue her. But I feel like Darcy really failed her because he put her in a really, he allowed her to be in a bad position where she could be exploited, preyed upon. And, obviously that's going to shape how she sees other men in the future and how it's going to affect her forever. And, Colonel Brandon's poor ward, I mean, she was ruined completely. And look at Harriet Smith's father.
Who was taking care of Colonel Brandon's ward when she was ruined?
He had entrusted her to, I believe he entrusted her to a friend, to stay with friends. And that's when kind of Willoughby swooped in and, did what he did. But contrast that with Harriet Smith's father, who is completely absent and unknown. And, the entire novel where, Emma's got us thinking that he's probably a very fine, gentleman or perhaps a member of the peerage. She's really kind of puffing Harriet up in her own mind and in everyone else's mind that, you know, she might really be like the daughter of a lord or a duke or who even knows. And then we find out at the end that he's a tradesman, you know, and you think about it, like that tradesman still could not have acknowledged an illegitimate daughter. He could not have acknowledged an out of wedlock daughter. And he did his very best to provide for her. So she ended up in a good situation with a respectable husband, a respectable home, respectable friends. And she was never put, well, maybe except for Emma kind of puffing her up a bit, she was never in any real danger of being, you know, swept away by an officer or a cat or a rake, you know, that was going to destroy her. So I want to give props to like Harriet Smith's father and kind of poo-poo on Darcy and Colonel Brandon. So that's my 2 cents there.
Can I just get back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to get back to Mr. Bennett again for a moment, if I may. We left that. There is a fantastic book, The Other Bennett Daughter. I don't know if any of you have read it. And in that book, he is an absolute monster to marry. Now, of course, this isn't Jane's viewpoint of him, but it's Hadlow's take on him. He is absolutely absent and more than that, cruel. And that reminds me of Sir Eliot's cruelty to his daughter. His vanity, he of all the fathers, I believe, was the most despicable because he absolutely dismissed her. She didn't exist in his own mind, really. And he did everything he could to thwart her happiness. And so in my mind, his vanity, his selfishness and his narcissism really could have ruined her. Thank God she had her mother's example and she lived long enough with her mother to have had a stronger character and not to resemble him in any way.
We haven't talked at all. Yeah, go ahead.
Do we know anything about Jane Austen's relationship with her own father? I think you posed that question early on. We don't know too much. We know he was a clergyman. We know he moved his family to Bath. We know he died. Do we know anything?
He encouraged her writing.
Yeah, I'd like to know too.
And helped her get her, it didn't get published, but he did help her sell her first manuscript to a publisher. Basically from, if I remember correctly, she pretty much had the run of his library.
He was a very attentive and thoughtful father. He not only was a clergyman, but he took in boarders. So he was a teacher of young boys, you know, that were lodged in their home. He was a good provider. Yes, it was possibly very thoughtless that he and her mother, she did not have a great relationship with her mother, decided to move to Bath. That possibly was very ill-advised, but they had lived in Bath and met in Bath 40 years before. And so the Bath that they were remembering was not the Bath that they moved to. And when he retired and gave his living over to his son, that really did do a number on Jane Austen that changed her and had her so in upheaval with all the moving around and all of that she didn't really write until, especially after he died. That changed everything. They lost his retirement income at that point, and that's when they had to start living with their brothers. You know, they went from cheaper to cheaper lodgings, and then they moved in with brothers or visited even with no home at all for quite some time before they took a house with one of her sailor brothers. But she had a wonderful relationship with her father. And you, besides Mr. Collins and Mr. Elton, who loom very large in our minds, her other clergymen and Mr. Grant, her other clergymen are heroes in her books, and she shows respect for. So she loved him. She loved her father. She wrote some prayers that he used in church. He encouraged, as you know, he encouraged all his children's writings. They had a really happy home.
Yeah, I had that impression too of the happy home, and they put on theatricals, and they Jane had her whole family listening to her as she wrote her stories, and you know, the run of his library. It sounded like both Jane and Cassandra had the opportunity to be more fully educated just by being in that school environment.
The father we have not mentioned, Sir Thomas Bertram.
Well, I would love to talk about Sir Thomas. I love Sir Thomas. I feel that he was very he labored under a disability in that his speaking was very formal, and to Fanny, she just was so in awe of him as a child, just as she was to the entire large space that was Mansfield Park. It talks about when she first arrived when she was 10, and she was freaked out by just how large the rooms were and how, you know, everything was valuable and precious, and she was afraid to even walk around. And what they saw as a quiet, good child, she would go to bed crying. And it wasn't until, you know, Edmund came and really understood her that she started to settle in. But, you know, Sir Thomas was, in his own day, he was a good father. He was looking after his children's education. He was, you know, getting dancing masters and art teachers and all of these different things for them. And he's besides that one sentence that Mr. Bennett says, where he says, I hope I don't get over this soon, you know, what's happened with Lydia. You know, I should be feeling it, and I hope I don't get over it soon. Whether or not he did, we know not. But at the end of Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas, he grieves, and he looks back at what is it that happened that caused the problems in his family. And, you know, he realizes that he was allowing Aunt Norris to be the indulgent parent that the children got their good stuff from. And he was the other half of the parenting equation, who was the stern, principled person, and that splitting it like that was a very bad idea. And he realized that he had given his children he had given them every advantage in education, but had done them a disservice when it came to morality. And so they didn't, and the word principles, they didn't have principles. And what most of us don't realize anymore, because our terminology has changed, in that day and age, principles meant Christian character. And so, you know, we see it even when the younger daughter is stuck listening to Mr. Rushworth's mother, and she's stuck walking around with her. And on the outside, she's listening, and on the inside, she's fretting that she couldn't get away. So you know, a good-hearted person would say in their self, they'd say, I'm glad I'm here, giving this lonely woman some time. Instead, she's only doing it for outward politeness. On the inside, she's fuming. And it says that she isn't able to muster the heroism that would allow her to do it in the right spirit. And so, but Sir Thomas realizes all this, and he grieves at the end. We don't see other fathers grieving, but we see Sir Thomas grieving that he failed his children.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, I agree with you totally. And, you know, because he was an authoritarian father, he didn't really openly show love to his children. And his wife was vacant. She was probably on opium or something, sleeping all day. But those children didn't seem to care about others. Perhaps they weren't able to really feel that love for others and compassion because of the way they were raised. But that's a good point about at the end of the book, he has a realization.
And he also realizes the value of Franny, and that all along she was wiser than he was, because she saw what, you know, this young man who was a cad was behind all of this. And he realized that it didn't, even though she had an education with the girls, she was educated as well, probably not as highly educated, but he truly loved Franny. And he got to the point where she was his little pet, you know, because she stood up for herself and she made wise decisions where the other girls did not. So, you know, whatever.
I very much agree with you. And his turnaround when it came to Fanny is there's a word for it and I can't remember, but it's a term that shows an about face that's like an ironic about face. And so what?
He's enlightenment.
So in the beginning, he's, you know, concerned. You hear in the first chapter, he's concerned that she will fall in love with one of her cousins, her male cousins. And at the end, he is eager for her to fall in love with Edmund, only hoping that it will happen, because he doesn't care anymore. His value system changes, and he doesn't care about position and money anymore. He just wants harmony. And it was Fanny had two heart desires. One of them was to marry Edmund, and the other one was to have Sir Thomas as a father. And her bond with him at the end is a delight of her heart. And I love how it says that he spent a lot of effort to make the house pleasant for her, and then spend all the rest of his time either trying to lure her back to spend time with him at Mansfield or go to visit her. You know, they had a daily relationship.
Thanks, and all your comments are good ones. Would anyone else like to say something who hasn't had a chance to speak?
Well, I've had a chance to speak, but
Heather, did you have something you wanted to say? You just raised your little hand.
yeah, I wanted to say about, sorry, what is Bertram's first name? Sir Edmund?
Sir
Anyway,
Thomas Bertram.
I agree about his turnaround and that he really comes to see what he has neglected. But I also think it's important to say that when he made that decision for him to be the authoritarian and to turn their upbringing to Mrs. Norris, it was a horrible decision. And she spoiled his daughters, and she basically abused Fanny. And I've read analyses of this story that make a really strong argument for her as a case of, you know, emotional child abuse, and the way she had her running all of her errands, and talked down to her and tried to make her feel bad. And so I think it's important to also acknowledge his responsibility for that decision. And I agree that it's a great turnaround, and it's atypical for Austen to actually have a father that can come to the recognition of those mistakes. But I also think it's really important to talk about the amazing amount of harm done to Amy by being put under Aunt Norris.
Very true. Heather.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to mention one of the questions that you had sent in the email, Elizabeth, was, did the fathers in the novels live up to their duties? And I just kind of wanted to bring up the idea that the only reason these men had duties were because they were part of this genteel class. A sailor didn't have a lot of duty and obligation to his child. The daughter was still a piece of property, certainly, but their obligation extended to making sure they didn't die to the best of their ability. It would have been nice if these requirements were across all of society, but they really weren't. They were really part of genteel society, which of course is what Jane Austen writes about. But when we're talking about did they live up to their duties, we know some of them didn't. We know some of them did. But at the end of the day, I guess the real question becomes, what is Jane Austen trying to tell us about the role of the father? Did she love her own father and what he did for her? It seems that we all kind of agree that she did. So why is she writing about such terrible fathers all of the time? My question kind of becomes, what is her purpose in talking to us about these terrible men when it's seemingly her own father did a pretty good job? Is it just for drama? Is it just for tension? Is it just to put our heroines in terrible situations? Or is it because she had a real question about society's roles and goals? And that's something I'd like to see if anybody had any comments on.
I wonder how many people she observed.
Well, first of all, about the financial situation, we do know that Jane always worried about money, and but yet she wouldn't marry just for money. She wanted to marry for love. So a lot of the stories, it's interesting that with the entailments and the fathers, if they pass away, the daughters and mothers wouldn't have anywhere to live. That may have been something that she related to. As far as the other issues with fathers, it's a good question. I mean, the failures of fathers in her stories really are what move the plots along.
I have something that's kind of tying into fathers and their duties with Mr. Weston in Emma, because he had to give up Frank to the Churchills at a very young age because his first wife spent more than she should have. So I think that's good that Mr. Weston gave Frank to the Churchills so that, yeah, he can live, well, obviously he's living very comfortably now with his new guardians. And because if Mr. Weston had kept Frank, there's probably no way he would have supported Frank in any way, shape, or form. But then it's interesting because with Mr. Weston, even though he's technically not the guardian anymore, I guess, but he's still Frank's biological father, he is very happy to go on about Frank, saying, Frank is great. I visit Frank all the time. So the whole village of Highbury is like, oh, we love Frank. We're Frank's #1 fans. And then when it comes out about Frank and Jane Fairfax and their secret engagement, like Miss Taylor, now Mrs. Weston, says to Emma, there's some part of his conduct that we cannot excuse with the secret engagement. But at the same time, both Mr. and Mrs. Weston are fine to forgive him for it. So that always just is like, wow, that's just so crazy to me. It's just, and then if you look at Frank, and I guess his new dad would be Uncle Churchill. Uncle Churchill seems to be like okay with the Aunt Churchill, like just doing whatever she wants and having her keep a tight control on Frank in terms of what he can and can't do. So just comparing what Mr. Weston, Frank's biological father, versus Uncle Churchill, his new guardianship / father, just comparing what they do for Frank and how that affects Frank in growing up and becoming his own person.
Well, remember, fathers ran the world. They made the ultimate decisions. They made the laws. Perhaps Jane is just making a comment on society, social society, families. I want to just read you a quick little paragraph out of this book. Oh, can you read it? Is it backwards? Oh, darn it. Well, the book is called Fathers and Jane Austen by Duckfield. And it's a short read. It's pretty good. And in the introduction, the author writes, "The fathers hold the key to the novels and to the destinies of the daughters. They represent power and authority within their families. How the fathers use their power and authority gives impetus to the story. The narratives derive from the father's failures, misjudgments, and neglect. They create difficulties which impair the daughter's happiness and their marriage prospects. Instead of promoting the daughter's chances of happy marriages, the fathers in these novels represent the biggest threats to it. Whether indifferent, cruel, selfish, withdrawn, stupid, spendthrift, or emotionally cold, Austen's novels provide a catalog of the mistakes a father can make and a description of the damage he can cause." Strong words. What do you think, Heather?
Well, so according to Duckfield, it's just part of social commentary. So I guess it's both plot device and social commentary. The plot doesn't exist without the commentary. And then the fathers are simply there to move the story along for the heroine. Without, for example, without Colonel Brandon not doing a great job of sending off his ward, well, it's not really his ward, but he took over. Without him offering that, of course, we don't have our heroine, well, one of our heroines, losing her heart and falling apart. And of course, we don't have their marriage at the end. So without all of these men's decisions, we don't have the choices. So the patriarchal society is social commentary, but the social commentary is required to move the story along. Even when the father has died, like Mr. Woodhouse, it's his choices and his decisions and the way he raised his son that push the women along.
Mr. Dashwood, yeah.
Oh, Mr. Dashwood, I'm sorry. Yes, no, Mr. Woodhouse is still alive. Sorry.
Dashwood's dead already, yet he's had a huge impact on the story.
And you know, it's not just his impact or what he originally intended, it's the way his son is so easily manipulated. Even though he might have been well-intentioned, certainly he didn't put enough, you know, fear into his son to stand up to his own wife. So sorry, I did not mean to kill Mr. Dashwood off, or Mr. Woodhouse. I'm so sorry, everybody. But yeah, so in a patriarchal society, you have to have the social commentary to move the plot along. But if we think about all of the terrible father figures, again, the rest of the story doesn't take place. We don't get the letter to Elizabeth from Darcy if Georgiana doesn't get, you know, molested, so to speak. None of these things happen without the bad parenting. At least not from what I can imagine.
Do you think Jane is saying in Sense and Sensibility, if perhaps Mr. Dashwood's son had a different kind of wife, he would have made different decisions with his stepmother and stepsisters?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, he sanctioned that marriage, so I think he's responsible there too.
Anyone have anything to say who hasn't had a chance to click in? Abigail, you've been very quiet. Lexi, did you want to say something?
Well, I think it's interesting that like a lot of these fathers, especially the ones who fall flat, are kind of showing us the other side of romance. So the core of all these stories is the romance, is you root for the heroine to get with the guy she is into. But even though, you know, the story may stop when they get married or a little bit afterwards, there's a whole reality behind marriage, you know, for the most part. the women will become mothers, the men will become fathers, and there's all these new duties that they're going to have to take over. And so I think Jane is showing us with a lot of these imperfect marriages and a lot of these less than ideal situations that, you know, the story might end on a good note, but there's a lot that's still up in the air for our heroines in the future. And I think she wants us to think about that stuff.
That's a good point. I mean, in conclusion here today, do we think the young adults getting married at the end of her novels are going to be better parents? Will Darcy be a good father? Will Mr. Collins be a good father? There's an ongoing struggle. Yes, Lori.
One thing I would like to point out is Carol J. Adams. Carol Adams is a big person in Jane Austen. She wrote an article in the New York Times that I love. It's called Jane Austen's Guide to Alzheimer's. And she makes a good case that Emma's father might have something like Alzheimer's because of his aversion to change and his fearful, ridiculously fearful things. And the fact that Emma says to Knightley at one point, "When have I been gone from here more than 2 hours?" You know, she can't leave her father because he needs her there. And so that's one way that I look at not only Mr. Woodhouse, but the good-heartedness in Emma that we need. We need to see her as a kind daughter to put up with all the rest of who Emma is. But she never embarrasses him in public. She's always working hard to soothe him without hurting his feelings or ruining his reputation, and yet being kind to the other people that he's trying to take the muffin away from because you shouldn't be eating that kind of stuff. So there's that.
That's a good point. He could have had Alzheimer's. You know, and I haven't really thought about Alzheimer's in the Regency period. I strongly suspect Alzheimer's is much more prevalent in 2020 than it was in 1800. I mean, first of all, people died younger then. And secondly, we're not even sure why Alzheimer's, how it comes about. There's been theories that it has to do with preservatives in food and chemicals, which they wouldn't have had at that time in their food. So, but that's a great thought. I had never thought about Alzheimer's in that era at all. It has to exist to some extent.
At least one book has suggested that he was autistic, which is another possibility with similar kinds of boundaries and issues of repetitive behaviors and needing structure and so on.
Another good point.
One of the things that has kind of struck me is you read a lot about how Jane Austen wrote based on observation, her fine brush on ivory. If her characters are based on her observation, one has to wonder about who she was observing to come up with these characters. Who did she know in Bath? Who did she meet when she was visiting with her brothers? Was some of this based on her older brother's interaction with their families? I don't think it's a coincidence when you consider the way Fanny Dashwood manipulated her husband, and you consider how long Jane and Cassandra and Mrs. Austen were wandering around looking for a home before Edward came up with the cottage. And that happened to be after his wife's death. So she may have had a great relationship with her father, but some of these other relationships might bear a little more scrutiny.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because we were talking about like plot versus social commentary, and I was reading them and thinking they're one and the same. Like you can have a really good father, but still identify the flaws in many fatherly figures that you have in your society around you. So I think that that's definitely something she's pointing out, that the parents, yes, do have a role in determining their daughter's fortune. Like those parents definitely are determining where that daughter's going to go, and they do have flaws. And that's where we get the drama and the plot. But it's because she identified those shortcomings in real life and said that, hey, we have this authority in our life, but that authority does have some flaws within it. And I think that's definitely what she saw, like what you were saying with kind of seeing how other people in her social circle interacted with each other.
It's tough not to have a flaw. I mean, nobody's perfect anyway.
I'd like to strongly agree with what Abigail just said, and just add a little bit more. Jane Austen, one of the things she is most valued and prized for, in using the wrong word, but is her keen observation of human nature. And her books are social commentary. And I don't think the social commentary is to move the plot along. I think it's, like Abigail said, they all go together in this wonderful big stew that she makes for us. And I think it's really important to look at the relationship she had with particular people in her life, and the idea that maybe her brother James does in fact relate to John Dashwood and Fanny Dashwood and their stinginess in Sense and Sensibility. But I think it's also important to recognize that she knew people beyond just her family as well. And she spent time in London, and there were a few families that she spent a lot of time with. So, plus she had imagination. You know, it's not all based on her particular life. So it's just, I think we need to give her credit for both. And I think it's really interesting to observe which things in her real life may have influenced her, but to also give her credit for writing beyond that as well.
Patty, yes. Unmute yourself, my dear.
Sorry.
There you go.
We go back to Mr. Weston again and the Churchills, because this is somewhat autobiographical in that one of her brothers got to go live with a rich family and be raised in a manner that her family did not have. And do we call Mr. Austen a poor father because he allowed this to happen? So we can't really say that Mr. Weston was a poor father, you know, when he had a situation as well. And could there have been a little bit of jealousy there because one brother got all the advantages that the other ones did not get? And then they were so happy when Frank was coming back. Well, I think Mr. Weston wanted a reunion. He wanted to accept him back into the family. So I think this may have been a bit of autobiographical input with the two families. Maybe not.
Good thought. Good thought. Anyone else want any comments about the fathers in the stories before we wrap it up? I see Autumn, you've just joined us late, but welcome.
Hi.
Hi. We did start at 2 o'clock. I'm sorry you missed most of it. Where are you coming from? What state?
Mississippi.
Very good. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, again, to repeat, this is coming from the Palm Beaches region of JASNA in South Florida, and we are going to have another Zoom meeting in August. The title is to be announced. Anyone have any ideas of anything they would like to discuss in particular? Just throwing out some ideas. We'd love to hear suggestions. There's so much we can talk about. All right, that's okay. We will come up with a topic.
I have a suggestion.
I have a topic, Elizabeth. What about Well, I've been hearing a lot of Mansfield. I've been hearing a lot of buzz about Mansfield Park lately in Facebook groups, and I've been rewatching the versions and rereading the book, and I like the whole Henry Crawford bad boy, not so bad boy dynamic. So I would be interested in either Mansfield Park or maybe something along the lines of the bad boys, or maybe not villains, but you know, not so much the Darcys and the Knightleys, but the other guys in
The Wickhams and the Willoughbys.
Yeah.
All right, that's a good suggestion. I like it.
I also have a suggestion, and that is perhaps engagements, because there are so many different kinds of engagements in the stories. The ones that everybody thinks is a great idea, and the ones that some people think is a great idea, and the ones that nobody knows about.
Right.
I think it would be kind of fun to talk about those.
Yeah, that's another great idea. All right, great. There's two good ideas. All right. I want to repeat again, if you didn't have a chance to see any of Louisville, Kentucky's JASNA Regions Festival last weekend, all their lectures are on YouTube, and some of them are really terrific. And if you hadn't heard me say before, the Pearls, Paste to Pearls was a terrific talk on jewelry of the Regency period. And it had a lot of surprises, a lot of things I hadn't heard before. And that is it, ladies.